Good day, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. Christine Ives Singer, Senior Advisor to SEforALL, and I have the good fortune of being your moderator and facilitator today. This is my fourth year of being in the very humbled position of supporting Sustainable Energy for All on the Energizing Finance Research Series. We'll get into a great bit of data and information for you today with some recommendations and about how to go forward in increasing the flows of finance for energy and meeting the SDG 7 goals. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. We have so much information to go through and a very robust panel who will be joining us at the conclusion of this. And so there's a goodly chance we'll be going past the top of the hour. And if you can, we'd hope that you could stay with us. It won't be long, but we want to give ourselves a little bit of time to be flexible to go over that hour. If you have any questions, because there's so much to cover, we don't actually have a Q&A built into the agenda, but please do put your questions into the chat box, or I'm sorry, into the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom, and we will get back to you with those answers and responses when we send out the survey on your participation in the webinar this morning. So with that, I have the pleasure of welcoming today Damilola Ogunbi, the CEO and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for SEforALL and co-chair of UN Energy, who's going to start our journey into these results with a few opening remarks. And Damilola, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and hello everyone for being here today. I'm delighted to be finally releasing this report. So much work has gone into this report, and I just wanted to start at the beginning, thanking Olivia and Christine for their leadership role and really taking on what is, just a really interesting and beautifully graphic report known as the flagship research for SEforALL called Energizing Finance. This is an in-depth research that examines supply and demand for finance across two key areas of energy access, electricity and clean cooking. As we face unprecedented challenges of COVID-19 pandemic and continued slow progress on sustainable development goals, this year's Energizing Financing series is more important than ever, helping to understand the barriers to energy financing flowing at speed and scale is necessary to ever meet the Sustainable Development Goal 7 by 2030. As the UN Secretary General has called for, this is now the decade of action for SDGs, and there's widespread recognition that the clock is running out to achieve them. The global community needs to move past advocacy and simply talking about the program and focus on implementation and concrete actions that enable solutions. COVID-19 has brought greater attention to the importance of energy access and how we need it to power infrastructure, healthcare services, including cold chains, for whenever this vaccine actually comes. With this in mind, we need to realize that action on the SDGs and recovery from COVID-19 share a common thread, and that is investment in sustainable energy. We will not reach our energy access goals unless sufficient finance is made available and then quickly and efficiently deployed on ground by private sector, government, and also DFIs. This is why SEforALL developed the Energizing Finance research to identify exactly where the world stands on financial commitments and disbursement for energy access. Along with our partners, Climate Policy Initiative and South Pole, we are focused on tracking finance in countries where energy access deficits are at its greatest. Today, 20 countries are highlighted in this report, which represents 80% of the global population without energy access. This is the fourth edition in the Energizing Finance Research Series and focuses on two key reports, Understanding the Landscape and Missing the Mark. Looking first at understanding the landscape, unfortunately, this year again has just shown and identified the chronic underinvestment in electricity and clean cooking access in countries that need it the most. Although the report finds increased finance commitments in 2018 compared to 2017, we are still nowhere close to the annual investment needs for universal access and clean cooking access, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. With an investment needed of 41 billion annually for universal residential electricity access, only $16 billion was tracked over 20 countries in 2018. Further, at the time when coordinating concrete actions is needed to address the climate emergency, we identified an increase in fossil fuel financing for 2018 and a decline in investments in grid-connected renewables, which is extremely worrying. This is the opposite of what the world needs to fight climate change and what it needs to actually recover better from COVID. Simply put, we cannot achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 if we do not achieve sustainable energy for all by 2030. Meanwhile, a lack of investment in clean cooking remains a problem that demands international attention. We tracked just $131 million spent on clean cooking in 2018 over the 20 countries, when there's an annual investment requirement of 4.5 billion. The numbers speak for themselves and should push us all to consider what new actions, new ambitions we're going to take in the clean cooking challenge. And clean cooking can just not keep seeming like just a stepchild to electrification. Our Missing the Mark report shows that already inefficient levels of finance commitments for energy access are suffering by woeful delays and lags in disbursements. About 58% of planned financing to the energy sector suffered disbursement delays. This is astonishing when these are projects that need to be done quickly. Despite this picture, the Energizing Finance creates hope that if we accelerate action, more people can actually receive power. This report is just really important for policymakers, development finance, donors, and stakeholders, and also for climate foundations and people are looking for where they should put their money and get the largest impact. This report shows clearly where you can do that for you to really leave no one behind. As we said many times, the promise of Paris cannot be achieved if sustainable energy isn't taken seriously. And the energy transition story has to also be an energy access story. The new Energizing Finance research will be critical in forming our work moving forward, especially in our contributions in the UN high-level dialogue in September and the COP26 in November. I urge you to use this valuable insight in your work to spark the investment and action needed on ground in the coming decade. Thank you very much, and back to you, Christine.
Thank you, Damilola. Damilola's comments included a couple of our key data points that we're now about to get into more specifically. And the one comment is we do encourage you to use this data and also to report back to us on how you're using this data and this evidence in your work and in your conversations with policy and decision makers. Again, thank you so much, Damilola, and we appreciate your leadership and your engagement today. Thank you. With that, I'd like to now turn to actually enable you to get your hands into, get your head into all of the data and the results that come from these two very, very critical reports. And I'm very pleased to introduce the colleagues I have worked very closely with over the last months in bringing you this information and this analysis. Olivia Coldray is the lead for Energy Finance and Clean Cooking at SEforALL, and my co-patriot, if you will, in this work that we've just achieved and announcing. Xavi Nieto, who's the senior analyst at CPI Global, who has led the CPI team in pulling this work and the accompanying knowledge briefs together. And Gaeton Hinosa, who's the practice lead for Climate Finance Advisory at South Pole. This was a very interactive and collaborative team, and I thank them for their engagement with us, their patience with us, and their leadership and insights in bringing this information together. And with that, Olivia, I turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Christine, and welcome from me as well on behalf of the SEforALL team. Thank you very much, Damilola, for your remarks. It's my great pleasure to talk you through some of the key findings from this year's reports, Understanding the Landscape and Missing the Market. I'm particularly delighted that we have our lead authors on the line as well, Xavi and Gaeton, who I'll turn to as quickly as possible, actually, because I'm keen to hear their thoughts on the research process and their interpretation of the findings. So we have a lot of ground to cover today. I'm just going to skim the surface. There's a wealth of detail in these reports that I commend to you in their entirety. So this is really just skimming the surface today, and I'd really encourage you to dive deeply into the reports in your own time to pull out the key findings and data points that we hope will be of help to you in your work on the ground. So just before I go into the data of the reports, I just want to sort of make a mention of scope of the reports. So the Tracking SDG 7 report this year tells us that about 789 million people globally are without access to electricity and about 2.8 billion without access to clean cooking solutions. This report, Understanding the Landscape as well as Missing the Mark, covers 20 countries that we call the high impact countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, South, Southeast and East Asia, which are globally home to around 80% on average of the population without access. So that 78% of the global population without electricity access are covered in the high impact countries, and 84% of the global population without access to clean cooking solutions based on Tracking SDG 7 numbers. So the coverage is broad, and we're really underscoring the point that these reports are speaking to countries with the largest energy access deficits. So two dimensions of energy access covered by these reports, both electricity and clean cooking, as Damilola mentioned. I'm going to start with a few key findings of commitments for electricity access in the 20 countries that we call the high impact countries. And I'll take a slightly unconventional approach by moving quickly to sort of outlook and recommendations, which I hope will sort of guide some of the data points that I'll speak to next. So a first call out also, as Damilola has mentioned, is chronic underinvestment in electricity solutions, principally in Sub-Saharan African countries. So that we'll see in the data as we come to it, there's a high concentration of finance in a certain number of countries, mostly in South Asia in 2018, which is the year that we've surveyed with the most complete data in understanding the landscape this year. To a large extent, Sub-Saharan African countries are being left behind. So our first call out, if you like, from this year's reports is one for more coordinated action among the development finance and donor community, particularly to increase the share of finance commitments that's going to Sub-Saharan Africa's countries and countries with the greatest need. And we'll see that in a little bit more detail in a few slides. Second concerning trend is a real spike in finance for fossil fuel projects in 2018 relative to previous years. So clearly that is disconnected to the energy transition and to the global climate goals that we've all committed to. And it's something that we don't want to see as a trend. We hope it is just a spike in 2018 and a pullback from there. But nevertheless, we would like to see more finance for renewables. Clearly accelerating and not continued investment in fossil fuel projects. And we will see that most of those fossil fuel projects were large coal projects. A third recommendation from our side based on the data is a call to more focused attention in policy efforts, as well as in business models and financing instruments for the off-grid sector, so both mini-grids and off-grid solutions. So we continue to see year on year, and 2018 is no different, only a tiny proportion of finance, 1.5% of all the finance we track to high-impact countries going to off-grid solutions, inclusive of mini-grids. So that's clearly inadequate in the context of solutions that can provide electricity access to people at lowest first cost in a lot of markets. Two major recommendations on the clean cooking side. National government's very instrumental in expanding clean cooking access, and we'd love to see that incorporated into countries' integrated energy plans. That's an issue that we take very seriously at SEforALL. We need clean cooking to be front and centre in countries' integrated planning processes and subsequently in their targeted fiscal and financial support. We're not seeing that necessarily, and the clean cooking numbers will show us that. Last but not least, the public finance that is going to clean cooking solutions in high impact countries, which is the bulk of the finance, we'd like to see diversified into the solutions beyond improved cook stoves. So the majority of finance commitments to high impact countries are still going to a couple of technology solutions, improved cook stoves and biogas digesters. There is a greater range of solutions available in the market, and we'd like to see the public catalytic finance from development financiers and donors really targeted beyond the usual suspects, if you like. So let's jump into some data. So Damilola has mentioned in 2018, we saw about $43 billion of finance committed for electricity in high impact countries overall across all tiers of access. Of that number, only around 16 billion was committed for residential electricity access in high impact countries. So the IEA tells us that about $41 billion per annum is going to be required globally to get to universal residential electricity access. So in countries where 78% of the problem lies in aggregate, it's only 16 billion that's going there. So clearly lower tiers of access, which is often a first step for households on the energy access or electricity access ladder, is being neglected in lieu of higher tiers of access. So I really want to pause on this slide to highlight the point about concentration of finance to particular countries. So these are the 20 high impact countries that we surveyed in 2018, drawn from the Tracking SDG 7 report. We can see that the top four, if you like, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan and Tanzania, are really attracting the bulk of commitments, particularly Bangladesh, India and Pakistan, all in South Asia. The balance of countries on this list are mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of Myanmar and North Korea. And we can see that the red icons showing us the population of each country without access to electricity. The countries with the greatest need are often the most neglected. And as we go further down this list, Angola, Burkina Faso, Yemen, etc., it's tens of millions of dollars in 2018 that we were able to track for electricity access against populations of 80% plus in some countries without access. So clearly there's a high concentration, and countries that are sort of most in need are being left behind again. And I'd like to say this is just a 2018 snapshot, but it isn't. So these are cumulative gaps in commitments year on year. As countries' populations continue to grow, that gap is going to be only magnified in terms of populations without access, as well as underinvestment. So we're talking about a chronic underinvestment problem in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. Okay, so a slide on uses. So I've mentioned fossil fuels, a big spike in 2018 for fossil fuel project finance commitments compared to 2017. So we've basically seen a relative flatlining between 2013 and 2017, but a really big spike in 2018. That was accounted for in large measure by a small number of projects in a small number of countries, which is outlined in the table on the right-hand side of this graph. So we saw a few fossil fuel projects of $1 billion or more in value committed to just 4 countries, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Mozambique. All but one of those projects are coal projects. There's one gas project in Bangladesh, but we're seeing continued really large amounts of money, and a large proportion of the $43 billion total finance commitments going to a few fossil fuel projects. That's clearly sort of inconsistent and incompatible with all of our climate goals, all that we're working for to accelerate the transition. The other side of that coin is a pullback in grid-connected renewables financing. So we want to see that sort of money accelerating. Part of that can be explained through increased capacity additions per dollar, given the increasingly and continuous lowering of costs for renewables technology, particularly solar. But even so, that doesn't. It's not an encouraging sign to see a pullback in grid-connected renewables financing. What this graph is also sort of telling us is where money isn't going. And I just want to highlight particularly mini-grids and off-grid, as I did previously, a decline in transmission and distribution infrastructure. That's interesting in the sense that if we had seen a massive increase in finance commitments for mini-grids and off-grid solutions, that could potentially explain a pullback in transmission and distribution for large grid-connected projects. But we've seen a decline in transmission and distribution, and no commensurate increase in mini-grid and off-grid finance commitments. We're also not seeing a lot of money go to energy efficiency year on year as the first fuel. And I'm sure the panel will want to come back to this. Market support activity is not a feature of finance commitments in 2018. So there's a lot to digest there. Also in this context, it's worth mentioning our friends at IRENA have recently released the Global Landscape of Renewable Energy Finance report in collaboration with CPI also. That report references or reinforces really the disproportionate flows of finance with regions representing approximately 120 developing and emerging economies, spread across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Those 120 countries are attracting only 15% of total renewable energy investment that was tracked in 2018. So let's sort of pause on that number. A vast number of countries receiving, a a small proportion of total finance for renewables in 2018. So that really just underscores the concentration point, both in terms of geographies and also money flowing to renewables. Sources of finance. So just to pause, a big uptick, relatively speaking, in corporate finance for high impact countries and electricity access, and from project sponsors. I guess another call out to make is that we haven't seen a lot of movement in development finance over the years. So year on year, both bilateral and development finance hasn't made a huge impact relative to growth in other sources of finance across the years. So given the catalytic role that development finance can play, particularly in countries with large access deficits, and particularly given those institutions typically broader mandates, we'd like to see a more focused effort on innovation in development finance institutions to really help catalyse the private sector money that we know is there. And I'm whipping through this quickly. I'm aware that we have a lot of ground to cover, so thanks for your indulgence for really the overview. Electricity finance by instrument, I know this is of interest to the panelists as well. As I mentioned, an increase in balance sheet financing, particularly from corporates and project sponsors. What we're not seeing is a growth in debt finance, and in fact a pullback in debt finance compared to 2017 numbers, and a modest increase in project equity, but still largely dominated by balance sheet financing and a reduction of debt finance. Switching gears for a moment, one sort of deep dive we took this year is a look at Rwanda. So Rwanda is not a high impact country, and in fact it has made great gains in electricity access over the last few years, thanks largely to policy reform efforts. What we did, and Shavi can speak further to this, is look at Rwanda's performance against the World Bank's RISE index, so regulatory indicators for sustainable energy, compared to the country average across Sub-Saharan Africa in 23 countries, excluding Rwanda in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also a look at how finance moved with Rwanda's energy market reform processes. So difficult to draw a direct correlation between increases in RISE scores and finance commitments, but there is an interesting story here about how Rwanda has performed across both metrics. So you can see their RISE scores increasing, substantially faster than the Sub-Saharan African country average, and a significant increase in finance commitments to Rwanda in 2016 and 2017, interestingly from both public and private sources. So difficult to draw a straight line, but some positive effects. So Rwanda has gone through, really some major restructuring of its energy sector, both in on and off-grid markets. It's reformed its tariff structures, and it's reformed its utilities and institutions, and that seems to be bearing fruit nicely in terms of RISE scores and finance commitments. Just to the right of this graph, we can see where some of those commitments have gone. And I guess, again, compared to the Sub-Saharan African country average, the point to note is a significant increase in renewables for finance commitments for renewable energy generation, as well as transmission and distribution infrastructure. So almost the reverse of what we've seen in the 2018 numbers for the high impact countries as a whole. So if you are focused on Rwanda, I highly commend this chapter to you as definitely worth a close look. Let's speak for a few minutes about finance for clean cooking access, which I know is going to be of interest to many people on the call. I guess the key point in absolute terms, about 131 million tracked for clean cooking solutions in high impact countries across the 20 high impact countries in 2018. That's a spike against 2017 numbers, but overall the story between 2013 and 2018 is not a consistent one. So it's been very lumpy, declines in some years, increases, pullbacks, and so on. So we're still light years away from the IEA $4.5 billion estimated requirement for universal clean cooking access. And don't forget, this is the high impact countries represent over 80% of the population with the clean cooking access problem. There's little evidence here of long-term strategic focus of financing activity for clean cooking. Where is it coming from and where's it going? The point to note in terms of sources is most money is coming from international sources, the vast majority, very, very little from domestic sources. Most of that money is coming in the form of grants from development finance and donors. And as I mentioned earlier, it's going to a couple of solutions largely. So improved cook stoves and biogas digesters. There's very little finance flowing to more modern, perhaps, solutions, ethanol, fuels, electric cooking, natural gas as a transition fuel, etc. So it would be good to see in future some focus from the international finance community, and particularly public financiers, towards those other solutions. Very interestingly, we saw of the finance that was tracked, private finance that was tracked for clean cooking solutions, a lot of that was actually going to those more modern solutions. So not so much improved cook stoves and biogas, but more diversity of finance. So that suggests the private sector is seeing the sector differently, seeing the clean cooking sector differently, and diversifying its commitments to various solutions. A note on geographies. So sort of even more starkly than electricity, perhaps, we see a huge concentration of finance for clean cooking in just 2 countries in 2018, Bangladesh and Kenya, at the expense of the balance of the 18 countries on this chart. So that's a very, very clear and year-on-year low levels of finance for clean cooking in many of the countries listed here, most of them. This slide is also interesting in delineating populations of countries without access in both urban and rural areas. So we can see that in a couple of countries, or some countries, Uganda and Madagascar, for example, that's pretty evenly split. So very high numbers of people, both in urban areas and rural areas, without access to clean cooking. In other countries, for example, Myanmar, to the right of the chart, there is a sort of a healthy level of access to clean cooking solutions in urban areas, but not so much in rural areas. So again, just underscoring the point about concentration. Finally, before I move on to missing the mark, I want to pause on our work on tracking finance for energy projects with a gender equality objective. This is some work we started last year in the context of understanding the landscape, and we've continued this year. So the key points to note here: overall development finance for energy projects with a gender equality objective, very, very low, between 2 and 11% of all development finance is sort of gender focused, if you like, in the energy sector over a 10-year period. That is mostly coming from a few sources, and they're listed on the right there in the map. So they're the top 10 public funders of energy projects with that objective. We all know that what we can measure, we can manage better. So this year's report introduces or proposes a new methodology to enhance tracking of finance for these projects, to enable donors and project implementers to really sort of get to the nuts of, where we how we measure outcomes and how we measure how effectively finance is spent on projects with a gender equality objective. So commend that chapter to you, and this is work that will continue and will continue to sort of improve ways of measuring these commitments better. Okay, so let's move on. Aware that I still have a bit to cover before we move to a panel discussion. I want to touch on the main points of missing the mark this year. Just for those who are unfamiliar with this report, this is produced every 2 years, the last edition in 2017, or the first edition in 2017. Really, this is about, even if we had all the money in the world, could we spend it? So as Christine likes to say, if we got the money, could we spend it? That was the question that led to the focused look on disbursements as part of our Energizing Finance series. So we could point to commitments and announcements, but there was very little attention, at least back in 2017, given to what level of funding was actually being dispersed on the ground. So it's only money that's dispersed on the ground that's going to have an impact, and it's going to help us get to SDG 7. So that sort of thought process, if you like, resulted in the title of this report series, Missing the Mark. So just a note on scope before I jump into some data. The analysis is solely on development finance, so we're only talking about public finance and only development finance in this report, as captured by the OECD Common Reporting Standards database. That doesn't include finance from China, Russia, and India. So there's a sort of a more limited scope, which is one of the reasons why this report is not directly comparable to the Understanding the Landscape report. So please bear that in mind as you read them. Let's start with some good news. Disbursements for energy projects in high impact countries have increased relatively faster than overall development finance. So that's great news. In other words, finance for energy is being dispersed more efficiently than overall development finance. So while that's a good trend for energy, it doesn't necessarily speak well to the efficiency of disbursement of development finance overall. Next slide is around comparison between disbursements and commitments over a period. Disbursements over this period, about $32 billion, quite substantially lagged commitments over the same period of $52 billion. So this is not, it's not a straight intertemporal comparison, because we know that generally what's approved in financing in year one isn't dispersed until later. However, as we see here, there is a continuing lag, not just a natural time lag between commitments and disbursements. So the trend overall is quite worrying. There are a number of reasons for this, which we'll come to shortly. A breakdown in terms of countries surveyed here. So the headline finding is that almost half of all projects in HICs, energy projects, were delayed across really quite a long period of time, 2002 to 2018. So there's been a slight decline in disbursement delays, not much, but that hasn't really changed the overall picture. In fact, the overarching finding here is that a majority of the finance committed to the energy sector, 58%, and 49% of all energy projects were delayed. And these were over 2,500 projects that Gaëtan and the team surveyed, analysed in the same high impact countries that we saw in UTL. So that's quite a stunning finding. So more than half of all finance and just about half of projects delayed. Just to concretise this, I'll use an example by reference to Mozambique. So based on understanding the landscape findings in 2018, Mozambique has an annual investment need of about $1 billion. Understanding the landscape tracked 162 million in finance commitments to Mozambique in 2018. So using the 2002-2018 average that we see on this slide, 73% of finance commitments to Mozambique were delayed across that period. And that means that only 44 million of the total was likely dispersed on time. So this is in a country where 2/3 of the population lacks access to electricity. So not only are many of the high impact countries not getting the levels of commitments that they need, which we spoke to in understanding the landscape, but what finance they do get is significantly delayed, resulting again in that continuing cumulative gap in access. Shifting to a closer look on clean cooking, we have around $30 million of development finance dispersed per year on average between 2013 and 2018. That is light years away, as I mentioned, from the $4.5 billion the IEA tells us is going to be needed to get to universal access. And it presents an even more negative view when we compare it to the World Bank's State of Access to Modern Energy Cooking Services report, which tells us that $150 billion per year is likely required for universal access to 2030 if you include subsidies and household spending. So it's really just 1% of the total need is being dispersed. Again, it's a stunning finding. So disbursement constraints, in addition to the very comprehensive quantitative assessment, Gaëtan and Marion and the team went out with qualitative reviews. So the findings here on this slide are informed not only by the numbers, but from evaluation reports, surveys, and one-to-one interviews with stakeholders from development finance, industry and government in our key focus countries, India, Madagascar, Myanmar and Nigeria. So, I mean, just to sort of briefly run through the slide, the respondents in the evaluation reports tell us that improvements in policies and regulations are not necessarily proportional to increase in disbursements. So we had a look at Rwanda again in this report, couldn't find a direct link in the short term at least, or direct correlation between commitments and disbursements and rise scores in Rwanda. The other findings are really drawn from the surveys. So poor administrative capacity and lack of coordination clearly is going to put us on a bad path for timely disbursement. Flawed project design came up again and again in survey respondents. So if we don't get project design right at the outset, that is very likely going to hinder timely and complete disbursement of funds that are committed to projects. Lack of access to local finance is an interesting one. Again, it comes back to project design. If we don't design projects with a view to end users, implementers, and access to local finance in mind, that is likely to end badly, or at the very least delay disbursements. And also, this will be very familiar to those on the call who are working in clean cooking, end users, again, a lack of knowledge about energy access solutions, particularly clean cooking solutions and their benefits, can hinder implementation. So if we have all the money in the world and the best solutions, if we don't have end users on board, that is not going to sort of help us disperse money on time for a successful project. So key recommendations, and I really will stop talking. Governments really need to create an attractive investment environment that comes back to sort of integrated energy planning processes for that sector, but also policies and programs that strengthen local financial markets and give project implementers and financiers real transparency and access to energy plans and the data needed to successfully implement projects. There's a real need, we heard from survey respondents, to have the private sector and developers strengthening human resource capacity in their own teams at managerial level, and for them to have a seat at the table in decision-making processes between donors and recipients. Those same players, donors and development finance, should combine their investment programs with technical assistance. So again, all well and good to have finance committed, but unless that is backed by capacity building and the technical assistance that's often required locally and in local institutions, that is going to compromise ability to get money out the door quickly. Donors, DFIs and recipients, really coming back to project design, should invest soundly in project feasibility studies and assessments before launching and diving into projects, and cut red tape as much as possible to make the project good from the get-go, and also allow timely disbursement most efficiently. And I just want to pause on the last point, and Gaëtan can speak to this. There's a real issue with data around measuring disbursement. So we relied heavily on the OECD database. There is no sort of dedicated track for clean cooking disbursements in one place. So, a plea, I guess, from this year's work is for the OECD and all its members, particularly multilateral development banks, to introduce more precise and standardized tracking indicators for funding to allow us to better measure progress, particularly for clean cooking, where the problem is biggest. So on that note, I'm going to stop talking and gladly hand over to Gaëtan from South Pole in the first instance. This is our first collaboration with South Pole at SEforALL in this Energizing Finance research series. I'm delighted to have them on board and to be in this partnership. Gaëtan and the team did a lot of work in crunching numbers, and Gaëtan, interested in your reflections on the research generally, anything you found particularly interesting or surprising?
Thank you again for inviting me here to present some of the findings and also provide my humble reflections on this report. It's the culmination of 7 months of work. So the bad news is that it looks like we have this suspicion, and it looks like we may be missing achieving SDG 7. It's not due to a single factor, and unfortunately there's no silver bullet by the looks of it. What I did find surprising is actually 3 things. Number one, we are not spending enough. So the significant gap of financing that goes to energy projects is very large. So we're not committing enough money to energy projects, let alone dispersing, and that's the bigger problem here. And the problem is even more salient with clean cooking. So this is something to bear in mind and was super surprising for us. Number 2, we were also surprised to see the level of delays that were affecting the finance that goes to energy projects. And that really amplifies the issue. As you said, Olivia, 58% of the finance is delayed, and 49% of the projects are also delayed. So delays happen, but in this case, because we're not spending enough in the first place, really the level of delay that we're seeing really further amplifies the problem. The third element that was quite surprising was to see that we are used to seeing, when it comes to barriers that inhibit the flow of climate finance, we're used to seeing the finger pointed at countries, national governments, more country-level factors such as not enough political leadership, no clear strategy, or regulatory environments that are not adequate. But in this case, even though those barriers persisted and came through in the surveys, what was actually more highlighted is that project-specific factors are also very important as well. And here I'm talking about real-life problems on the ground, like lack of capacity, administrative issues, lack of coordination. And this is something that actually was surprising as well. The good news is that actually, because of our extensive research, we are proposing some recommendations. So it's not all doom and gloom. Number one, it became quite clear that we just need to have better projects on the ground. And what do I mean by that? I mostly mean we need to have better designed projects. So it needs to be very tailored to the context and can't just be copy-pasted from another country. Number two, we actually need development finance institutions to take a bit more risk. We know that they tend to be perhaps a bit more comfortable with larger investments to reduce transaction costs. And we're seeing that actually smaller ticket sizes are very important as well. So it's not just the level of risk that need to be improved here. We need to take more risk in our investment, but also look at smaller ticket sizes. And number three, national context really matters still. We need governments to really show leadership and a clear political long-term strategy when it comes to energy access. We need them to also be better improving the regulatory environment that goes with it. So these would be the main sort of recommendations, along with the one that you highlighted, Olivia, that we need to be much better at tracking what we're seeing on the ground. The issue with energy access, technologies energy access as a whole, is that it's a shifting market, and we just need to be better at measuring that.
Thank you very much, and really value the collaboration. And we know just how much work you've put into both the number crunching and actually finding the numbers in the first place, to your last point about clean cooking in particular. So that's a good learning for all of us. I'm going to hand over to Shavi now, who is an old hand in understanding the landscape. She's been involved since the word go. Shavi, given that overview of many years' data now, let us know what you found interesting about this year's work, what surprised you, what you'd like to see more of going forward.
So thanks, Olivia. And I'll keep my comments limited because I know we have an excellent panel set up for today, but would mainly like to stress again that, year after year, we're seeing that energy access investments are falling short of what is required. And this is despite the fact, that all SDGs, including those related to climate change, related to gender equality, health, hinges on access to affordable and reliable and sustainable energy access. So the slow progress and limited volume of investments on SDG 7, to say the least, is totally unacceptable, especially in the light of the collateral damage it can have on not only on these SDGs but also on Paris Agreement, especially when we continue to see fossil fuel financing in this year's report. Also, it is particularly surprising for us is because the money that is needed here is not astronomical. For example, we are looking at around 4.5 billion per annum for clean cooking and around 21 billion per annum if we just focus on Sub-Saharan Africa for electricity. So this amount of capital exists, but there's a clear need for innovation in how it is mobilized or dispersed and allocated. And despite the grim picture that you presented, I also want to highlight some of the bright spots that we saw in the report. So 7 countries were Sub-Saharan African countries, which receive more than 90% of their electricity finance in renewables and mini grids and off-grid solutions, which shows that a part of the world is able to, kick their fossil fuel addiction and call a moratorium on it to an extent, even though the amount that they receive was small. And this becomes really more and more crucial than ever to phase out these fossil fuel investments, as we see that, countries like India and Bangladesh are sort of hinting or supporting a fossil fuel-based COVID recovery. And this only magnified the transition risk related to stranded assets and could also, affect the goals that are set up by Paris Agreement. Another thing I just want to highlight, which was good, was also that we saw, in clean cooking sector especially, that private providers were not only focused on improved cook stove, they were investing a lot of widespread technologies like biodigesters, ethanols, etc., the upcoming technologies, in a sense. So this is sort of critical demonstration, right, to private investors. There's some innovative business models are working and are commercially viable. What we now need to do is kind of replicate those to sort of innovative and disruptive out-of-the-box financing mechanisms to work for these different HICs. So yeah, and just to wrap up, I think we're short of time, but just want to say we really need to move on all fronts, be it stakeholders, the capital providers, technologies, business models, financing models, etc., to get all the required investment that we need if we are serious about achieving SDG 7 by 2030. These modest increases in investments are not sufficient. We need sort of a gear change. So I'll stop here. I know there are a lot of other speakers have great ideas on how to immediate action on and unleash these investment and scale. and how to eliminate the barriers that have been talked about by Gaten and you. So really looking forward to our discussion today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Xavier. And I guess just two reactions. Thank you for highlighting some bright spots. This job is sort of a lot about doom and gloom, presenting these findings, but it's very important to highlight where we are making progress and good stories. And secondly, you've used the phrase speed, outcomes and scale in the report. And so SOS, time for energy access, and we wholeheartedly endorse that in the need to sort of move everything forward. So Christine, back to you, and Michael and Toyin. Super keen to hear your reflections on this year's work.
Thank you, Olivia, Gaetan, and Xavier for bringing more of this data to life. And again, there's so much more in these reports than we've been able to cover thus far. So I encourage all of you joining us today to really dig in and think about the data and the results that are in there. I want to pick up on the SOS that Olivia ended us with, and the call, if you will, to implementation action that Damilola put before us, and introduce our two speakers. I'm not going to go into a great bio on them. You can look them up because I think it's more important to hear about them. But I'm going to ask them to unmute themselves and get ready to join. Michael Franz is the team leader of Get Invest, which is a European program funded by the EU, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Austria, that focuses on mobilizing investment in energy projects and companies. Toyin Olubak is the Associate Director of Portfolio for Acumen West Africa. He's responsible for driving Acumen's investment strategy in the region. And for those of you who may not be aware of Miguel or Toyin's organizations, both of them are key intermediaries for channeling capital from donors, aggregating capital, bringing it together and getting it into the field for implementation. I'm really excited to hear from them. And having a conversation with them previously, I know it's going to be quite interesting for you all. And I'm going to jump into the first question. From your perspective, Miguel and Toyin, on the energy access finance sector and your work on the ground, what is causing the substantial delays in disbursements? And what are the top 2 to 3 ways that you would recommend that we could mitigate these constraints?
Thanks, and thanks for having me and for this opportunity. I would like to make clear that I'm taking off my program hat today. I'm just talking as somebody who's been in this now for 13 years. I also want to say that indeed, I'm now implementation level. I'm not a policymaker myself, but I can observe that at the policy level, there is a great deal of commitment to do the right thing. And I think what you're doing here is very important to inform that kind of work. So that is really instrumental. And there are people that are going to be willing to listen and change and improve also how finance flows. The finance landscape has changed in the last couple of years a lot, but there's more work to be done. You asked about the barriers, the main things that need to be addressed. I would like to point out 3. Yeah, one, the demand side. One can only finance what is ready to be financed. Yeah, and that was outlined in the presentation. You mentioned the RISE indicator and even the short-term reaction that wasn't there. Well, indeed, it takes time. And let's take the example of Nigeria very briefly, where progress has been made that took years on the policy front. Now the business development is happening. We can see that this is happening. And then the finance can deploy. Yeah, and it's really that sequence that needs to take place. Secondly, and briefly, we need to partly do finance differently. We can expand on that. And thirdly, also from the policy level, we need a bit more support in terms of less rapid turnover of new initiatives and more stamina and more long-term perspective. And I would like to leave it here for an initial remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Toyin, based on Acumen's work, which we know you have a very robust portfolio in both electricity and clean cooking, what do you see as the barriers to disbursement?
Thanks a lot, Christine. I'm really pleased to be part of the conversation that we're having here. I think diving into what might be an expansion of one of the points that Michael just mentioned, and also I think I heard Gaetan touch on something similar, Xavi as well, when she mentioned innovations in finance. I think when a lot of these projects are designed, there's a top-down view that looks at the big picture. And I feel to some degree that big picture is a bit further ahead than the bottom-up side and the details, the execution side of things. And so I think that there is a bit of a mismatch there, and some work to be done in bringing all sides up to par, where the financing can flow a bit more freely. And then within that as well, I think when the financing value chain is often thought out and spoken of, we hear some of the important, distinctions around DFIs, commercial investors. We hear about sort of international investors to a market and the domestic financiers in the market. Something that sometimes I think everyone realizes but doesn't quite necessarily take a lot of detail into looking into is the perspective of investors having different stages, sizes, and risk appetites, which is very important because you can design a really important and well-structured project that takes that big picture into view. But if the initial risk capital has not been taken account of, then they will then struggle to deploy the capital that unlocks, what gets everyone to the big picture. So I think that's something else that that has been an issue in the system, and I like the way Shabi put it, that there needs to be work around innovating in the financing itself. The third thing, which I think there's a great example in the clean cooking space, is that again, a lot of the primary drivers to the way a lot of programs are designed and even a lot of solutions are designed focuses on the top-down sort of realization of the climate change issues. Whereas at the consumer level, the climate change is not a driving, deciding factor in how people will spend their very limited income already, when we're speaking of people at the low-income sides where this impact is most highly felt. And so I think not just how the challenges are discussed, but even how the solutions are designed, how financing is designed around the solution needs to take account of the fact that at that end of the market, for starters, for a lot of people, it's not actually a priority. And so the solutions, the financing programs, the policies need to take that into account. And then even if, you make that a priority, then you then need to look at, what they can afford vis-a-vis the alternatives they've been using, and how do you sustainably move them in the direction where everyone is looking to go. And so again, I think, that disconnect has come from a lot of top view driven efforts, and there needs to be a lot more engagement from the bottom up side as well.
Thank you. I think both of those perspectives really bring to life some of the findings in both, particularly in the Missing the Mark report. And there are a couple of comments I want to repeat back. One is I appreciate the phrasing of the big picture is ahead of what's happening on the ground. And also that we can only finance what is ready. So what's happening on the demand side, which really reinforces the Missing the Mark findings around the project concerns. It's not so much the external factors that have caused the delay, but rather the on the ground implementation factors. So with that, let me flip it back to you. One other thing I want to acknowledge is that we need more stamina, right? We need more flexibility in some of these programs to relate. So what can change? If you were invited into the decision-making arm of the gathering of the development finance institutions, and they said to you, what are the things we can do? Tell us specifically, what can we do to change and overcome this disconnect between where the global community is and it perceives and what the demand side is doing? What would be your recommendations? And again, you're speaking as individuals, so we can be a little bold here in what our recommendations are.
Okay. Again, Toyin, if you allow me to start. By the way, I agreed with everything that you said. Yeah. And
likewise.
What I want to say is that for the DFIs, with respect to the DFI colleagues, there's a lot of people in the DFIs that are understanding what the issue is and are working very hard to change it. At the same time, the DFIs are, of course, also in a tricky place. They're endowed with public funding. They're not in the business of losing money, and they're under pressure to be efficient, like we are. And a lot of the business models that need to be deployed at scale look or feel risky. It's relatively new stuff. I mean, this has moved very quickly in the last 10 years. This whole sector. So therefore, there needs to be a conscious decision to allow the DFIs or their subsidiary instruments that they set up, that they capitalize, to take greater risks and to live with the fact that sometimes there's failures, and that some loans will go bad and so on and so forth, because these are difficult market contexts in the first place and also innovative business models. But it's a bit hard to expect the DFIs to do that themselves. Of course, there is a bit of that. There is a bit of a policy push. That's what I'm saying, because the DFIs are also mandated from a public perspective. So that needs to be there. And at the same time, of course, the underlying risks need to be addressed. Because otherwise it's not going to add up. Second point, the eternal issue of the transaction cost versus ticket size. That it's almost as difficult to finance something small than to finance something big. Well, something's got to give, and that means that we will need to set up or capitalize intermediaries, and this is happening. I want to be fair and not name names, but there is a lot of development in that space. We just need to more of it, and also have the patience with these instruments to learn how to walk the talk and make the difference. And probably we should also, and maybe I'm completely out of the window here, but we need to allow the DFIs to have higher transaction costs simply, and ease that pressure, those internal pressures as well on them. But otherwise it would be a bit cheap to simply call on the DFIs, change your ways, So there needs to be that conscious decision that this is what we want to do. And I know it's there, but we need more of it. And then these intermediaries need to be set up, capitalized, and then you need a TA on the ground, and these need to be coordinated well for policy, for projects, for finance, and these need to speak to each other, and then we can go much faster. And that's also where part of the improvement needs to take place, in the programming, in the planning. And I know much of these efforts are ongoing, but we need more of that.
Thank you, Miguel. And for folks on the line, I know we're at the top of the hour, but please, if your schedules allow, please stay with us a little bit more. I know that there's more good questions coming and certainly some comments. So if your schedules allow, please do stay with us a little bit longer. Toyin, I'm going to switch the gears a little bit on my follow-up question to you, which is you're responsible for the portfolio in West Africa. So I understand that's your perspective. Did it surprise you to see the disparities in the way funds were flowing to the 14 Sub-Saharan African countries who sit within that suite of 20 high-impact countries? Did it surprise you? And do you have any recommendations about what can be done to bring these countries forward in terms of not just the commitments to finance, but also to the level of disbursements that they're receiving and the efficiency of those disbursements?
Sure. So I think the short answer about whether it surprised me or indeed within Acumen would be no. And I say that for primarily two reasons. Because we are talking about returnable capital here. It's whether it's concessional or commercial, it is expected to be returned. It's not philanthropy. So the commercial drivers are critical. And so what we've seen is the capital has flowed primarily to countries where there is a combination of clear policy, clear enough policy for people to sort of plan how they will drive something, whether it's operators or investors, and a combination of that and sort of the market potential. And so just, what is the size here? And even in how, we have had to look at some opportunities, we've seen that come up. And so sometimes, we've seen we've seen companies operating in environments, we've seen great companies operating in very unclear policy environments. And so, when you're making an investment that's meant to be potentially 10 or more years, that's substantial discomfort to bear with. That becomes very difficult for an investor. Whereas, when the policy is much clearer, then it's easier to sort of take some of the steps that you need to take. So I think, for obviously, when it comes to the market size, that's not something that can be changed at any country's level. But from the policy perspective, I think to the point that, again, has come through with Miguel's comments and other comments as well, more support, more clarity around that space, I think will make a notable difference. And to one of the examples that you used, and also from the report, we see a case where in Rwanda, there's been relatively substantial flow of funds into that market, and it's not because it's the biggest market even in East Africa, much less across Africa. But I think just having the certain level of policy clarity, trust in the government, those things have made a difference, and they've allowed things to flow.
Excellent. Yes, Miguel, please join us.
To build on this briefly, and for transparency's sake, you're talking, I'm a TA provider, that's my line of work, so, but having said that, on policy, often there's talk about the policy framework that needs to be in place. I just want to point out one thing. Maybe some indicators don't quite capture this, because it's not just about the policy framework being in place in terms of the documents being available. It's also a matter of the people that are involved and the processes to actually be able to deal with this. And I could give you a couple of examples. And with respect, these business models are new. We can't expect a regulator to be, just like this in a position to deal with a new policy that has been put in place, that provides a framework for, say, investments in mini-grids, to simply wave it all through, and then every banker is happy with it because they have confidence that the whole process works. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of these people and capacitate them in the right way. So it's not just the papers. I've often heard the phrase, but we have a policy, but it's not just about the paper on the shelf,
I just need an anecdotal response. That is what drove the first Missing the Mark report back in 2016, 2017, which is, okay, if we get these commitments, can we spend it? And do we have the human and systemic capacity at ground level to process, to absorb and utilize the level of finance commitments that were being at that point predicted or projected as needed? So I think that's really critical.
If I can just...
Oh, please, Tony, go
ahead.
Sorry,
yeah, I just wanted to agree with that and re-echo that. And that's why, for instance, my comment was the policy and the trust, because it's when people see that capacity is there, or the willingness is there, that the trust follows the paperwork of having the policy there. So yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's really important to emphasize that as well. Yeah.
And let's remember, it's not just the energy policy. It's also the financial regulations and the financial investment environment. Absolutely. Miguel, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because there's a parallel here, because this in the same way goes also for the projects. The reports that we're discussing today are about delays in disbursement. And we have a parallel here when it comes to the efficient setup and deployment of the projects themselves. There's really ways how one can mess up development project design, and end up in a situation where you cannot deliver. For example, if you choke yourself on your own administrative procedures by inefficient tender processes, for example, and we're spending taxpayers' money. In our line of work, every single feedback loop costs us a week. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And I really wanted to emphasize this.
That's your point about stamina.
That's the point about stamina, but also a correct project design. I want to really emphasize this. This is very important. Yes.
Yeah. I want to bring us to a close with the following question and your recommendations to all of our colleagues on the line, which is still a very healthy number, by the way, so thank you to you all, is based on your review of this material, the presentations you've heard, how would you recommend people on the line, whether they're from private sector, government, financiers, DFIs, civil society organizations, how would you recommend they use this data and this evidence? This is a new question, so I'll give you a moment to think about it as well. But we really want this data and evidence to be used for change. We have an SOS out there on commitments. We need more commitments and announcements, but we certainly need more deployment and action at ground level. Do you have a recommendation or a perspective on how best this information and what it enables us to envision could be used? For those on the line,
the first
question, so I stumped him a little bit. Toyin, please.
The first thought that comes to mind sounds a bit obvious and maybe even cheeky, but I think, given that we're dealing with, on the policy level, it's governments. On the DFI level, it's also related to governments. And so we're not talking about spaces where innovation and being nimble is sort of like the way of doing things. And so I think for start, this data enables really concrete conversations to push back on how some of the things that are currently being done and sort of accelerates, the players into this space of considering how they can innovate. So whether it's in how policy is designed or implemented, whether it's in the financing structures, something really important that Michael and again other people have mentioned, I think, is in breaking down ticket sizes. And so how is that being done? What are those smaller tickets going to be directed at? I think, just this allows us to say it's not just an individual experience. The status quo is progress, but it's not sufficient. And so even though it's progress, and it's very easy to, take a step back and, blame the financial institution, blame the governments. But I think, understanding that everybody has a perspective they're coming from, stakeholders to deal with, processes to deal with, the data really enables everyone to sort of come back to the table and say, yes, there's been progress, but we're far from being at the point where we can actually pat ourselves on the back. And, there's a lot more that needs to be done urgently. One of the comments that Damilola made at the beginning, which I noted, was that, for instance, with clean cooking, it is often treated as, the little brother in the corner. But when you think of the impact, and I say that, about the wider market, not necessarily about the people who have the interest and are here, but how does that get elevated to the point where, people start to see that as important as the issue with lighting, which I think a lot of people more generally understand as an issue. And where we have the data like this, I think we can use that to put a bit more fire in the conversations. We can also use the data to be a lot more targeted about how, what specific solutions are needed. So we're not just saying innovations are required. That's a really broad statement. We
Exactly.
can come back and say, we need to innovate in this space. We need to look at, it might be a policy issue in certain HICs. In other HICs, it might be about the financing structure. For instance, and, without not to take up too much airtime, in Nigeria, there are great programs in place. A lot of them co-designed and authored by Damilola before she had joined SEforALL. And it's fantastic work. Now, some of the innovations that are needed are not necessarily at that policy level in Nigeria, but where it comes down to making the risk financing available at the earlier stage to catalyze what will then enable that big picture to become the reality. And so it's allowing for that sort of specificity to happen in conversations going forward, I think.
Excellent, thank you.
Please.
Miguel,
And
turn to you for the last word here, please.
No, I want to agree. First, I want to really start with this bit because very often discussions are at a too high level, and I understand that messages need to be simplified in many contexts. But at the same time, the world has grown more complex, and it's growing ever more complex. One of our own contributors, and I very much appreciated that in our advisory board meeting last week, said we need to have a proper discussion at a good granularity level about exactly what solution is needed for which problem. And to hear that from a donor is very, very, very encouraging. Yeah, in terms of what to do with it, because that means we're not just going to have some, silver bullet kind of discussions, but actually, what are the different problems and what do we need to do? With this kind of work, what can we do? 3 levels, I should say. One, we need to know about it. And so we need to get the word out that this exists. And SEforALL has fantastic traction, but I would encourage everybody else to also have done this already once it was freed, shared this already with some colleagues. 2, in our world, in the development because I'm a public funded program manager, team leader of a public funded program. So we need to work with such kind of documents in our justifications for what we want to do, And then at the policy level, people can now, on the basis of such kind of evidence, maybe redirect some of the funding, use this as justification to redirect some of the funding, and then specifically steer some of the instruments, because that is their role at the policy level, and also in the design of new instruments, should that be necessary in the first place, adopt these recommendations. And then for us at the implementers level, we can then work with this and adjust our programs or use this again as ammunition to justify what it is that we do or that we want to do. And
Excellent.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Toyin. And Miguel ended with a word that I always have in my mind when I think about these reports is, and it's not always a great word, but it's ammunition. It is evidence and data for you all on this line to go out and utilize in your conversations with partners, stakeholders at the government level, funder level, civil society level, at the customer level, right? So a couple of things in closing. First off, I want to thank the over 100 folks who are on the line for staying with us. I certainly want to give thanks to our funders and supporters who have enabled this work to go forward. 2021 is going to be a big year. The main reason is we're going to have 2020 behind us, but beyond that, it is a big year in the world of energy. We have COP26. We have the high-level energy dialogue at the UN in September of next year. We have opportunities for this data and evidence to inform and change what's going to come. Also next year, we'll be launching the 5th year of the Energizing Finance Research Series. And based on planning, there'll be 2 reports that will come forth next year. It'll be the 5th year of understanding the landscape, looking at commitments, hopefully seeing those continuing trends moving up more expeditiously than they have in the past. And we'll also be incorporating the 3rd report of this series, which is Taking the Pulse, which will be looking at the demand side. What is needed in the market? We've talked about supply. We've talked about the efficiency of disbursement or absorption. What's the actual demand? And where does it match up to the types and instruments and flavors of capital that we're seeing in the market? Lastly, I want to ask all of those on the line, as you use this data and evidence, let us know. Let us know how it works for you, because part of the challenge is convincing donors and funders that this work is critical, is making a difference, and is leading to change. So with that, I want to again first thank Miguel and Toyin for bearing with us in this conversation. I'm sure we could have gone on for a while, but we all very much at SEforALL appreciate your engagement and your perspective from the implementation ground level bottom up. And again, thanks to all of my colleagues at SEforALL, CPI, and South Pole for engaging with us over this 7-month journey. It feels like more than that at times, but I think the end products are incredibly valuable for all of us to reach 2 things, SDG 7 goals and leaving no one behind. Thank you very much. Stay safe, stay well, and use this data. It's here for your use.